Hello. This video is going to be about the differences between men and women. Um, I'm not 100% sure that everything I've thought of is true, but it makes sense to me and I thought I would share it. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, and so far as I know, my view on this is unique. It's not completely different than what everyone else thinks, but I've never seen anyone else express it in this way and put it all together the way I have. So I'll just get started. I'm reading from an essay, so it's going to be scripted. And I know my face is boring, so I'm not a very expressive person, so I won't be offended if you play free cell or something while I'm talking, because I do that when I listen to other YouTube videos. Anyway, I'll just get started. It's in the way of things that a man's reproductive success is limited primarily by his access to women, and a woman's reproductive success is limited primarily by her access to resources, so she can take care of herself and her children. So if you believe in the theory of evolution, then you have to believe that all of our inclinations exist in order to facilitate survival and reproduction. So the natural conclusion is that, in essence, men are glorified fuck machines, and women are glorified incubators. Because a woman's primary concern must be for the well-being of herself and her children, a woman's sense of self is limited to her body and her feelings, with her children being an exception because they come out of her body. The psychology of a man is different. The physical act of sex is really simple and it's not that hard to... It doesn't take much brain power to figure it out. But it's actually getting the sex which is hard. Men have to do things in order to get it. So it appears that men as a whole have learned to think of things outside of themselves as being a part of themselves. The exact way in which this manifests appears to be different depending on the culture, but it seems to be universal that in one way or another, all men consider their actions in some way or another to be a part of their identity. It's for this reason, I think, that when a woman pours herself into her work, she's adding something foreign to herself, and can break herself if she does too much. But when a man pours himself into his work, he's completing himself. And I suppose I could reference a statistic to that. I don't have it with me now, but I remember reading that women were happier before feminism, and they tend to break down more often due to stress. Whereas men more often break down when they get a divorce or something or get fired, probably because they're losing part of their identity. And in that sense, I suppose you could say men are kind of more fragile than women, because you can have things external to yourself taken away from you, but so long as you're still alive, nobody can force you. So long as you're not being physically abused, then your body's fine, and nobody can force you to feel something you don't want to feel. So I suppose in that sense it's harder to break a woman's sense of identity than a man's. Anyway, I'll continue. On the purely instinctual level, men love women's bodies because that's what they need in order to have sex, and likewise women love a man's utility to her. His utility could be his labor, his money, his social status, his genes, or something else. In a sense, both sexes use each other to get what they want, and this results in prostitution, either formally or informally. There's a bit of danger in this relationship that many men don't seem to understand, in that whereas it's impossible for a man to separate a woman from her body, if it's possible for a woman to separate a man from his utility to her, they'll often do this without a second thought, which is what happens in divorce court. There's also a higher type of love, which is rather rare, especially in the modern world, which is to love someone else simply for existing without expecting anything from him. And in healthy cultures, people were taught to strive for this kind of love, but generally speaking, the lower type, the base instinctual type, never really goes away entirely. And the baser love, which I've kind of discussed already, is basically just to view other people as a means of satisfying your own desires. when you have some degree of higher love for another person, you're inclined to sacrifice for the benefit of that person. If you have the baser love, sacrifice really doesn't happen, because you would never sacrifice unless you expect to get something more in return, and then it's not really a sacrifice. So self-sacrificial love comes in some sense from this higher type of love. And in general, when you love something this way, you want to give everything you have for it. And because men's and women's sense of identity is different, this type of love manifests differently between them. If what I said above is true, or previously, a woman is her body and her feelings. So when a woman has a true sense of love for another person, she gives that person her whole self. And this can manifest itself by gladly enduring pregnancy, breastfeeding, and sleepless nights for the sake of her children. Or it could manifest itself as willing sexual submission to her husband, putting her own desires otherwise apart from sexual beneath her husband's, and even trying to change her own tastes in order to be more compatible with her husband. This does actually seem to be something that women do, and men for the most part don't do, is actually changing their own tastes to fit their partner. And I think for this reason women have a greater capacity for compassion than men, because they have less structure in their own soul. Like it's not as steady, because they have nothing outside of themselves to anchor themselves to. So when they are compassionate, it's possible for them to submit their whole being to the needs of that person, more so than it's possible for a man. Although on the other hand, in the modern world, this doesn't manifest itself very often, this greater capacity for compassion. A man views his actions as being a part of himself, so when a man is in love, he is more likely to try to act to change his environment for those he loves. It's natural for a man to labor to protect and provide for his family and society, and to sacrifice his physical and emotional well-being for those things. That type of love is rarely reciprocated by a woman in kind, because it's not in a woman's nature to endure physical hardship for a man. And the differences I've discussed here are reflected in traditional gender roles. Women in the past were typically defined by their relationship to men. A maiden was a woman who was under the authority of her father, and a wife was a woman who was under the authority of her husband, whereas men were always defined by their careers, like he was a carpenter or blacksmith or farmer or whatever. And of course the wives worked to support their husbands, but mostly doing domestic chores, but those were accessory to her role as helper to her husband. Whereas it seems to be kind of the reverse for the husband, whereas the husband obviously was attached to his wife. The wife was his helper to help him with things he was doing in his life, like his career. And the emphasis was different. And feminists think that this was because men hated women and oppressed them, but feminists are addle-brained. And something else interesting I thought of is that if it's true that a man's sense of self is tied to what he does, then it seems to follow that a man can't find peace with himself until he invents or adopts a code of conduct which can tell him what to do, or what he ought to do with himself under a wide variety of circumstances. And I think it's for this reason that men invent religion and build civilization. I don't think a man can be truly masculine without a religion which demands a certain sort of conduct from him. And it doesn't have to be the type of religion that most people think of. I think of religion more as a code of conduct, like I just said, that you believe somehow that there's a higher purpose in life and you ought to do something about it. I think that's the core of a religion rather than a god or myths, although of course those are also very important, especially depending on which religion you have. And I think if it's true that a woman's sense of self is limited to her own body and feelings, and that people express love, or the higher type of love, by giving what they are to another, then it seems to follow that a woman can't properly express love except when she submits her will to the will of another. And I suppose men have to do that as well, but I think, like I said, it's different for a woman. Like, a man can express love. It's more natural for him to manipulate his environment, like I said. These are more general trends. I should have talked about that later, but these are more general trends than absolute rules, I think. But I think they're still very... the general trends are profound enough that it's worth taking note of. And the authority that women submit themselves to typically has to be male authority, I think, since there's nothing stable in another woman that a woman could submit herself to. So I don't think a woman can be truly feminine without a strong masculine presence in her life. And I'm basing these ideas on my own thoughts and thinking about how things were in the past, because obviously things don't work this way anymore. And I believe that's what I talk about in the next paragraph. Yes, it's for this reason that the traditional structure of authority in all traditional cultures has been God, and then man, woman, and children. And men invent and follow religions, which are always the basis of any culture, and the women submit themselves to the vision of the world that men have created. And women are typically only interested in religion insofar as it makes provision to protect and provide for them. So I believe the collapse of traditional religious ideas in the West is connected with the collapse of traditional gender roles. If a woman submits herself to a man who lives for a higher purpose, and especially if this higher purpose contains an element of reverence for the femininity, I don't think I should have said an article. Anyway, then she can do that while maintaining her own self-respect, and the man can assert his dominance over her without feeling guilt because he knows that he's doing it for out of a sense of love rather than out of self-interest. But when a man has nothing greater to apply himself to, this relationship breaks down. If he's not got any higher purpose he's striving towards, then asking someone else to submit to him is just a pure matter of force and self-interest rather than anything higher that he could claim. And I believe this different sense of self is also related to how people think of respect and honor. When a person says that you should respect a woman, they typically mean it in a similar way how you would say you would respect a child, which is that you ought to be considerate of her body and her emotional needs. But when someone says that a man is worthy of respect, they can mean a variety of things, which typically means something like respect for a man's autonomy, his expertise, or his authority. And I think a man's sense of respect for each other's autonomy produces a manly sense of honor. It's dishonorable to lie because men can't make informed decisions based on false information, and it's dishonorable not to do what you say you will because other men may be depending on you. So I think this sense of honor is innate in most men because we're social animals, and men view their actions as a part of their identity. I think in general, actually, most people understand others by projecting their own views onto them. So that kind of would naturally produce a sense of honor among men, even though most men aren't as honorable as they ought to be in the modern world. I think it's still there somewhat. They have a concept of it, even if they don't really follow it. But I don't even think the concept is even in the heads of women, unless men teach it to them. And I think a woman's sense of respect for body and feelings leads to things like flattery and white lies, which are, for men like myself, those are rather distasteful things. The difference between the genders also reflects itself in politics. Men need to concern themselves with power in order to get sex, and women don't. So politics is entirely the domain of men. Women have no genuine political thoughts, and they vote for whoever is most popular or whoever promises to give them the most stuff. So political action by women is limited pretty much to nagging men to get them more stuff. And it's for this reason that minority political parties are entirely composed of men, or almost entirely. and women only join once that party, or if that party achieves some degree of success. And I think the United States was founded on a manly sense of honor, respect for personal liberties and freedoms. The force of government was supposed to be limited to punishing dishonorable acts. But as the U.S. has become more feminine, the ideas people attach to the same words have changed. Freedom has changed from meaning freedom to be left alone to the freedom to do and have whatever you want. And equality has changed from meaning equality under the law to equality in every material and social outcome. And now the government has turned itself into the universal husband of women and concerns itself with catering to every asinine whim of the public, and especially women, and punishing offensive behavior. And as for sex, male sexuality is basically defined by acting upon the female, and female sexuality seems to be defined pretty much by being desired and acted upon by the male. And there's also cognitive differences. Men's brains have evolved to help them manipulate their material environment. Men on a whole are slightly smarter than women, 5 IQ points, and are especially better at math and working with their hands. And women's brains have evolved to get men to give them things, and so women on the whole are therefore more attuned to social situations and things that are related to communication, such as languages. And these things used to be common knowledge before feminism changed all the curriculum to cater to girls' and boys' expense, and before they made it effectively illegal to punish honest statistics, since professors have been fired for punishing strictly factual IQ statistics. And women in general have less sincere interest in academic subjects. Nearly all math, science, art, and philosophy of any importance has been created by men, and the people who appreciate these things are likewise made up of a majority of men. Girls in school understand primarily the social expectation that they learn certain things, and they apply themselves diligently to the subjects because that's what they're told to do, rather than because they have any innate interest in any of the subjects. And also, on the whole, men take their professions very seriously, whereas women, unless they're an actual physical want and they actually need a job, generally view their professions more as a game. And due to men's greater concern for understanding and manipulating the physical environment than women, they have a greater stability in their thoughts and actions. I'm pretty sure people of both genders are bombarded continually throughout the course of any given day with an array of absurd thoughts, but men are much less likely to take the absurd thoughts seriously because they have their eyes fixed on something outside of themselves. Whereas a woman has nothing else inside of her soul to occupy herself with, so when an absurd thought comes to her, she's much more likely to take it seriously. I saw a poem once, like an ancient Norse poem, that women's hearts are put on a spin wheel. And in the Genesis in the Bible, they obviously talk about how Eve screwed things up. So people all over the world used to understand this type of thing. And of course there are obvious physical differences too. Men are bigger and stronger. And I saw one statistic that surprised me, that 80% of untrained males have stronger grip strength than even female athletes. And as a conclusion, I want to talk about generalizations and individual exceptions. In this feminized age, it's politically correct to treat individuals as groups and groups as individuals. Whenever it comes to job applications where an individual candidate must be considered, affirmative action quotas force companies to look first at the demographic group of the candidate before they look at his qualifications. And likewise, whenever somebody makes general statements about a group as a whole, some social justice warrior is quick to pull out a statistical outlier in order to disprove the general trend. And there is indeed a difference between individual cases and statistical trends, but the existence of one doesn't disprove the existence of the other. I actually believe that the majority of people have difficulty in completely conforming to the expectations that are put on their gender, and that this would be true even if we didn't live in a society that continually lied to people about race and gender. Men, of course, have feelings, and it's unreasonable to genuinely expect men at all times to completely suppress their emotions in order to do their duty. We ought at least understand that that can make things more difficult. And of course, there are some women who do take genuine interest in the subjects they study, although I think this is a lot more rare than what politically correct people realize. And so there are exceptions, of course, but the study of patterns depends on generalizations. Unless you're dealing with purely abstract mathematics or particle physics, then no two situations are going to be exactly the same. So thinking about patterns requires neglecting minor differences and noticing overall trends. And I think any person with minimal intelligence and a genuine desire for truth will understand, simply from personal experience, that although virtually no one is perfectly masculine and virtually no one is perfectly feminine, that there are very large differences on the whole between men and women, and that these are more than sufficient to justify different societal expectations. And that'll be the end of the video.